Oh, hi everybody. How's it going? Really? I mean, we're here for Tim Gunn and Mary Beard, right? I know you're not here for me, but you got me for a minute. My name is Aidan Flax Clark, and I work at the library. I'm part of the team that brings you these events. So I'm thrilled to see this beautiful house of Mary Beard fans. Tonight is a great night. I don't know how we've managed to do this, but we've managed to get Tim Gunn and Mary Beard together twice. We've managed 2 years in a row to have Tim Gunn be here twice within a week, once to judge a Halloween costume contest and another to interview an eminent historian. Yeah, it's a very weird pairing of events, but it works. And I hope that it's the beginning of a long tradition. And of course, tonight Tim is speaking with the one and only, the eminent, the brilliant Mary Beard. See, this is why we like libraries. We're all here like cheering for classics on a Friday night. This does not happen really anywhere else, I don't think. So tonight's actually kind of a rematch for Tim and Mary. They were here about a year and a half ago talking about Mary's last book, and now they're here talking about Emperor of Rome, which is the follow-up to her blockbuster smash, SPQR. And I love saying blockbuster smash because not a lot of people can say that they have one of those with any kind of book, but to have a book of ancient history that's a blockbuster smash is amazing. But how many of you have read SPQR? So you know why it was a blockbuster. Mary has an approach, I think, to history that's all her own. It avoids chronology, it searches far and wide for a really diverse array of sources, and above all, I think it's rendered with a level of empathy and care for people who are very, very long dead, at a level that I think many of us don't offer to our fellow living, breathing humans today. I know, that's kind of sad, forgive me. Well, you're going to find all of that in Emperor of Rome and a whole lot more. The book covers the history of Imperial Rome from Julius Caesar to Alexander Severus, one murdered in 44 BC, the other murdered in 235, although Mary writes in the book that there are fewer psychopaths than you would imagine. And for those of you who purchased your books in advance, Mary will be signing copies over here. And actually, for all of you who purchased them, line up and get your book signed, please. And if you have a library card and you didn't buy a book, you can check it out along with all of Mary's books and Tim's books with your library cards. And obviously, everyone has a library card, right? Yes, okay. Good. I mean, you would be ashamed of yourself if you came in a library and didn't have a library card, right? And we would find you, and we would shame you. Okay, so Mary will take some of your questions at the end. You all got some note cards when you came in. Please write your questions in the form of questions on your question cards. We love questions and less interested in statements. And if you're watching online, you can email publicprograms@nypl.org, or you can put your question in the chat, and we will get those too. Wherever you are, we would love to hear from you. So please send everything you've got. They'll get to as many as they can. Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Ispahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos, and it's made possible by everyone here. So thank you again for being here. Let's give it up for Tim Gunn and Mary Beard.
Well done, well done.
Thank you, everyone. Mary?
It's great to be back, and great to be back with a rematch with you, Tim.
We had a blast the last time, and I was thrilled when I was asked to speak with Mary again. It was just wonderful. I have had the privilege of having an advance copy of Emperor of Rome. And Mary, what I want to say is that what I find so completely captivating about your work is the element of surprise. I never know where you're going to take us.
Well, that's the idea.
I know, but it's not the idea of most authors.
Yeah, but I think also it's quite important with ancient Rome, because there is a kind of sense that it's not that we think we know about ancient Rome, but it has a kind of classic, bland, a bit boring. I mean, I know some of us think about the Roman Empire 7 times a day. But maybe that's part of the point, that we think we know about it. And of course, when we imagine us as being these kind of emperors that got the rogues gallery on the screen here. We imagine ourselves as generals, toga clad, wearing little military skirts. And I think one of the things I've wanted to do always is to say, that is part of it. It's not that that's not part of what ancient Rome is, but actually there's much more, and there's much more that's surprising. And the more you look at ancient Rome, and I think the same would go for ancient Athens, but what I work on is Rome, the more it comes up from behind and tells you something new about it.
Well, it does. And I think that part of what you're saying speaks to what Aidan said about the fact that you're writing thematically and not necessarily chronologically.
Yeah.
And that, I believe, removes that fog of what we anticipate.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, there is something that is quite frightening for most people, me included, about the history of Rome, particularly the history of Rome after Julius Caesar, the period of one-man rule. And somehow we've all got the impression that in order to understand this, we have to know, exactly who Vitellius was, right?
Yes.
And that if you can't know the biographies of these people or know what order they came in, well, give up, guys, in thinking about ancient Rome.
And you unshackle us.
And I want to say, look, most Romans couldn't have given you the main achievements of Elagabalus, bottom right. I couldn't tell you what the date of Edward III of England was.
Oh,
right?
that's good to know.
I don't even know what century he was, And you don't always need to know those biographical details to be able to get a sense of what the job of being the Roman emperor was, what they did all day, what they ate, who they slept with, how they traveled, because they were actually, and I think the bottom row of these emperors here makes it very clear, they're actually much more similar than they are different.
Interesting.
And the whole kind of biographical tradition, going back to the ancient world, has sort of convinced us that these guys were all very different. Actually, they presumably were different, but they were much more the same than they were different. The job description of the Roman emperor did not change for hundreds of years. So let's think about what that job description was. The vices and virtues of them didn't change. And so I'm trying to say, free up, everybody. Don't worry if you don't know who Marcus Aurelius or Antoninus Pius is. It's fine. It's probably an advantage.
Excellent.
So
one of the things,
enjoy, forget about them,
One of the many things I learned from your book is that there was no clear line of succession. Fascinating.
I think the most extraordinary thing about the dynasts that ruled Rome, from the first emperor here, on the top left, Augustus, you can include Julius Caesar if you want, right through beyond Elagabalus on the bottom right, is that there is no clear reason why any one of them succeeds any other, right? Now, I live in a hereditary monarchy, I'm afraid. I'm sorry, but I do.
You do.
And all my life, I have known that little Prince Charles one day was going to be King Charles. There was no way that anybody else was going to come to the throne, and the British monarchy has a very clear rule that the firstborn, and until recently the firstborn male, succeeds. Now, there's an advantage to that. there's no question about who's coming next. There's a disadvantage that any old idiot might end up on the throne just because they happen to be the firstborn male offspring.
Very true.
Right. Now, Rome doesn't have that, and it doesn't have that even in property succession, actually. And it has an advantage that it opens up to a relatively narrow circle who might be the next emperor. The disadvantage, unlike the standard British European monarchical system, is that you're fighting out all the time who might be the next guy on the throne. That succession is always contested. You're always wondering who the emperor is marking out for the next person to succeed him, etc., etc. So most court cultures like Rome are edgy and self-regarding and wondering, who's important, who's in. In Rome, the utter unpredictability of succession means that everything that happens around the emperor is tinged with that problem. Who's going to be next? We don't have to take his totally unsuitable, wastrel firstborn son, but who's it going to be?
Well, and I also learned from you that it meant that the emperor could say, let's get rid of these potential people, because we don't want them to succeed me.
And, I think people often write about the Roman imperial court, the Roman Empire, the palace in imperial Rome, as having terribly blood-stained corridors. Now, I think in part, it does have blood-stained corridors, right? I think most corridors in the Roman world were a bit blood-stained, honestly, actually. Rome is a world in which the way to solve a problem is ultimately to kill it, literally, right?
Yes,
And
lots of it.
Let's not beat about the bush about that. But I think that, Aidan said that, I don't think there's so many psychopaths on the throne as we normally think, and I think that's true, but I think that you're in a world of problem solving, and you kill your way out of those problems, or at least you are believed to kill your way out of those problems. And you can read Robert Graves' I, Claudius, you can look at the telly-series of I, Claudius, you can read Suetonius' 2nd century biographies of the Roman emperors, and you will see endless allegations of poisoning. Now, I have to say, as a great American ancient historian said to me when I was an undergraduate, Moses Finley, he said, it's very hard to tell a nasty case of peritonitis from a nasty case of poisoning, right? And that is true. And I think there's probably a lot more peritonitis here than poisoning. But the important thing is that poisoning, murder is always on the menu in Rome. You're always thinking that death is suspicious. That death is suspicious because he is no longer part of the favored circle who might be on the throne. And that is reasonably common in most monarchies that don't have a fixed rule of succession. And as I say, there's advantages to that, but the disadvantages are, well, I'm never going to quite trust the apple that you hand me.
Yes.
In case it's actually designed to do me
Just
in.
in case. And you wrote that the closer that you were to power, the harder it was to survive.
Yeah, I'm afraid, it's tough at the top, right? And it's very tough at the top because when you get to that second rank, the people who are influencing the emperor or who want to replace the emperor, then there are no rules. I mean, we think of Rome as a kind of culture of law, Now, I think it is a culture of law in all kinds of ways. There's a pretty academic version of law. It's about how you think about problems of inheritance of state, of property. It doesn't actually kind of feed in so much to, what are we going to do about, my inheritance. It's very, if the ancient Greeks were philosophers, the Romans were lawyers, and they were doing much the same thing. They're thinking about how you think about problems. And you're in this world in which, basically, and I think it's very hard for us to intuit, but basically death is the way that you deal with things. And,
yes.
And, I think it's interesting that there was no way of ceasing to be emperor. The first emperor who abdicated was Diocletian at the end of the 3rd century CE. So the only way you stop being on the throne is by falling off your perch, quite literally. You die. And hence, all the stories, true or not, that any individual emperor, his end was not natural. There is not a single emperor from Augustus, who died in 14 CE, and who was the first proper emperor, to Domitian, who died in 96 CE, BCE to CE. It's over 100 years of imperial rule. There's not a single ruler of Rome about whom some rumor didn't say they were murdered. Now, I suspect that many of them died relatively peacefully in their beds. But the idea that murder was the way you got on was absolutely built into the system.
Yes. And also, I didn't realize until reading your book that the 3rd emperor, Caligula, that in fact we've all heard of Caligula, evil, horrible person. I didn't know that Caligula is a nickname.
Yeah, Caligula means bootykins. Caligula hated the name bootykins, and it was a nickname given to him when he was a little boy with his dad on the army camps, and they dressed him up, and you can imagine a modern politician doing this. They dressed up this little prince in little miniature army uniform, and the soldiers then all called him bootykins. Caligula, his real name was Gaius.
Yes.
And he's an absolutely classic example of, well, we don't know whether a misrepresented emperor or not, but I'm pretty certain that some people in the audience will have a vague recognition of the story that Caligula wanted to make his horse a consul, right? That one of the reasons that Caligula was so bonkers was that he was so attached to his horse that he said, I think I will make him chief magistrate in Rome. And there was a wonderful, if any of you remember the BBC, then later home box office series here of Robert Graves' I, Claudius, there was lots of very nice scenes of Caligula really kind of smoozling up to his horse, right? And it's always thought of as, the absolute acme of an emperor gone mad, right? To make an animal. Now, there's 2 things that I think I have come to see about Caligula. One is, and I think this is not so new, that that I'm going to make my horse a consul may well have been a joke that went wrong, right? That, he's confronting the other aristocrats, and he's basically saying, you lot are so bloody hopeless. I might as well make my horse a consul as you. And it goes down as Caligula wanted to make
Yes.
his horse a consul. I think even more to the point is that, and this is one of the reasons that I'm kind of unhappy with individual biographies of emperors, is that we think that that is peculiarly Caligulan, you know, that he wanted to elevate his pet, basically it's his racehorse. Actually, if you look thematically and not biographically, you discover there's a whole lot of other emperors who do silly things with their horses. I mean, one of the marks of being a slightly off-the-rails emperor was that you honoured your horse too much. So there's Hadrian, bottom left, goody old Hadrian. He writes the most disgraceful bit of doggerel about the death of his horse, right, which he inscribed, and we still have the verse. It's really terrible. And Commodus, you know, a bit later, Hadrian's a trad goody, but Commodus is not a trad goody. He's a baddie. He's the anti-hero of the film Gladiator. He also was overcommitted to his horse. He fed the horse human food, and he painted its nails gold. Now, you know, when you see that, you start to see that this is not an individual kind of idiosyncratic quirk of Caligula, but that one of the ways you judge emperors is by their relationship to their pets, right? And we kind of take out one and forget that there's lots of other examples like that.
That's a good segue, because I'd like to talk about some of the thematic material in your book. And in particular, Mary, I'd love to hear you talk about Imperial Dining. This is fascinating.
We all know how emperors ate, because we've seen it on the movies, right? They lie down, they eat extraordinary concoctions of, you know, dormouse and flamingos' tongues, all messed up. And they say, you know, pass the grapes, Marcus. And it's, you know, we saw it in Claudius, we see it in any Roman movie. And actually, I think it's, for once, a place where the movies don't get it quite right in terms of seeing what's at stake in the banquet, but the imperial dinner party is more than anything else where you see the vice or virtue of the Roman emperor or his guests. You know, so that the cruel emperor punishes misdemeanors cruelly, right? So Caligula. Right?
And at the dinner.
At dinner, actually at dinner. You know, so there's a horrible story of an enslaved waiter who is believed by Caligula to have picked off a bit of the silver inlay from a couch to presumably flog somewhere. And Caligula is supposed to have had his hands cut off and strung round his neck, right? And that's used as a kind of example of bad imperial government. Tiberius is supposed to have been a bad emperor because he actually was a bit penny pinching. He served up leftovers at dinner. Right, now we think this is prudent, right? And he used to have half a wild boar cooked rather than a whole wild boar to avoid waste. People thought it was terrible. On the other hand, you can see that someone like Claudius, he comes out well out of dinners, because when, and this is a good old restaurant trick now, when one of the guests pinches the golden goblet that he's been served at to take home as a souvenir, you know, because he's dinner with the emperor, I'm going to take home a bit of the bling, right? Claudius does nothing, except the next time the guy comes to dinner, he's the only person who's being served of plain pottery, right? But I will just show you, can we just have the slide 5? I mean, because one of the most extraordinary stories about dinner clusters around the emperor who was at the bottom right of the previous slide, a young teenager ruling in the 3rd century CE. And one of the stories about him is that he invites senior figures in Rome to dinner. And at the end of the evening, to show his generosity, he scatters rose petals all over them. So many that they smother and die. And this is what the 19th century Dutch-British painter Alma Tadema is trying to capture in this picture. And I think it's it's also an interesting story, because one way of telling that story, and I'm sure it's partly true, is to say, I'm sure the telling is partly true, I'm not sure about that the story is true, is to say, look, Elagabalus is a teenager. So part of the point of the story is to say, look, this is what happens when you've got a teenager on the throne. Doesn't quite know what he's doing. You know, he tries, he does all this, and it all goes horribly wrong. Now, as I say, we don't know whether the story is true, and probably isn't. But one of the things I do in the book is I try to say, but what is that story really about?
Yes, right.
What is it really about? And it seems to me that it's about saying you have to be careful with emperors, because when they're generous, they are their most dangerous, right? You know, the generosity of Elagabalus is amazing, more riches than you can imagine, but it kills you.
Yes.
He's also the guy, by the way, and I shall let Tim move on to the next question. He also is the guy who invented the whoopee cushion. Just if you want to know, Elagabalus' claim to fame, he had his guests reclining on inflatable cushions, and throughout the evening, he had the slaves let the air out, so that they ended up on the floor.
I have to ask you about Elagabalus' name, because he sounds like a horrible disease.
It does. It does sound like a horrible disease. We don't really know the name of Elagabalus.
That's what I learned from you, and I found that fascinating too.
His proper name is something like Antonius Severus Bassianus or something like that. He's called, and has always been called since antiquity, after the name of the god that he tried to introduce to Rome. He's a Syrian teenager, had served partly in Syria as a priest of the god Elagabal, and he tries to introduce the worship of Elagabal into Rome. He builds a vast temple of Elagabal, and he then becomes known as Elagabalus in order to kind of link him with his god. And I start the book with Elagabalus, partly because he is about the most extreme Roman emperor that you can ever possibly imagine. If you think Nero is extreme, he is a pussycat compared with Elagabalus. And you have a fantasy biography of him, which tells the stories like the rose petals and the whoopee cushions and all, he never wore the same pair of shoes twice. It's kind of Imelda Marcos kind of syndrome. They're wonderful stories because you can see, because they're so extreme, that you don't need to bother whether they're true. A lot of people have studied Elagabalus and have thought, right, now which of these stories are true? We haven't got the foggiest clue, and probably none of them. But what they do, like here, is that they show you what it is that you fear about a Roman emperor. You fear humiliation, you fear that you're going to be killed by kindness, you fear that you can't believe your eyes, that he he subverts nature. You know, he only eats fish inland, you know, and that's partly a sign of how rich he is. Well, I never eat fish by the sea, right?
Right.
You know, I only eat fish inland. It's partly saying this is imperial autocratic power, at least in our imaginations, trying to upturn what nature should be and do. And so he's, you know, when people used to often, in the presidency of Mr. Trump, they used to often email me from America, journalists will ring me up and they used to say, which emperor is Donald Trump most like? Now, I either used to give them a little lecture about why that was a really stupid question, but you needed a bit of time for that. If I didn't have the time, I would say Elagabalus. Not actually, because I think Trump is like Elagabalus, but I thought that at least it would be great if they all went and read up about him.
Or not.
A bit of Googling.
When I first met Mary, I shared a image of Trump dressed as a Roman emperor with the title, "Full of Shiticus." Before we leave dining, though, I just want to ask you about the complacency of guests. For instance, I read in your book that there was a couple, he was evidently poisoned and keels over at the table, and his wife just pretends it didn't happen.
No, it's his sister, actually.
Sister, I'm sorry.
I mean, it's either about complacency or, again, that story. It's a story about Nero poisoning or having poisoned, so it was said, maybe peritonitis. They thought it wasn't peritonitis because the funeral pyre had already been prepared. So it looked as if it was not, in this case, peritonitis. This little boy, teenager, Britannicus, falls over dead, poisoned at dinner, and his sister just goes on eating.
Eating, yeah.
And you say, how do we read that? Well, I mean, one way of reading it is that it is absolutely taking murder on the menu for granted, you know? Or, and I think this is how Tacitus, the 2nd century AD historian, suggests we should take it, that it's again about how autocracy perverts the very nature of human relations. You know, what happens in a court? Well, your brother keels over dead, and instead of rushing over and saying, you know, can we have an ambulance, please, right? You just go on eating. And I think there is a kind of sense there that the image of the court and the people who surround the emperor is an image of a place where normal, natural, in inverted commas, human reactions no longer apply.
Well, you wrote that it was very important to not show emotion.
Yeah, you know. I mean, there's another great story about Caligula, which says that in the morning he executes a young man. In the afternoon, he invites the young man's father to dinner and insists that the guy tells jokes and laughs. And one of the commentators on this says, well, why did he go along with that? And the answer was, he had another son.
Oh, dear.
Right? And I think with all these, and I really would put a health warning about the literal truth of this. I'm not sure that we have any reason to suppose, beyond the fact that the stories are told, that any of this happened. But it seems to me that all these stories are true at another level. If you want to think about what is scary about the imperial court, it's scary because the normal rules of what humans do to each other no longer apply. And the closer you get to autocracy, the more you see that you can't believe your eyes, you can't react as you would normally react. Your son has been killed, you're supposed to mourn. You're not supposed to go and spend the afternoon with his killer having a joke.
And was this fear-driven?
In part, it must be fear-driven. I think so this is going to sound a bit academic.
No,
now,
please.
But
You are.
that's what I do. That's what, I think about the Roman Empire all the time, right? I think that it's partly one of the ways that Roman writers, no doubt a wider group in Roman society, tried to analyze what was the matter with autocracy. Now, we don't tend to think of the Romans as thinkers, as clever analysts of their own political structures. I think that's because we don't recognize their analyses when we see them. And I think they use a very different kind of analysis from ancient Athenian writers. And I think these anecdotes, which they tell so insistently and so much the same, one emperor after another, are actually pointing us to ways in which they are saying, this is the problem with one-man rule. And
Yes.
as I think in all kinds of ways they do accept it, but they're not dim. And the stories that we have taken as bloodstained corridors of power stories, I think are also, or instead, they're the ways that these guys are trying to say, what is the matter with one-man rule? How do you critique it? Why is it different from the kind of democracy that it replaced?
Yes, yes. And when you look at it, you think, well, this doesn't look particularly good.
It doesn't look particularly good. And I think that Rome gives you a really interesting case study of people who, according to these anecdotes, recognize that the imperial court is a kind of dystopian world in which nothing is as it seems.
Yes.
And, when the emperor is being generous, he's actually killing you, right? And at the same time, and this is, I think, where it applies a bit to us, at the same time, most of these writers are, at another level, absolutely accepting one-man rule. Mm. They are not. They like to present themselves occasionally as dissidents, but they're not. They're basically collaborators going along with it, but part of their head allows them to say this isn't right. But I think one of the striking things about the Roman Empire is that although people object to individual emperors quite a lot,
Yes.
they don't, from very few decades into the system of one-man rule, they don't challenge one-man rule as a system at all. So the system is terribly resilient. The poor old individual rulers get bumped off all the time. But the system of autocracy, which they see the problems of, survives for hundreds of years in the West. It survives until the 15th century in the East.
Yes, yes.
We say the Roman Empire ended in the 5th century AD, CE. That's because we have a very Western view of it. Go to Turkey and Byzantium, Constantinople, and it's surviving till the 15th century.
Yes. Very, very, very true.
Yeah.
And just a general acceptance of its being embedded into the culture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there doesn't seem to be, maybe there is, below stairs and we don't see it. There seems to be a acute awareness of the problem and no real sense of explicit objection to it, which is, I think, a good reminder for us.
It's a very good reminder.
Because, which of us are going to be the collaborators or the dissidents when we lose democracy, I'm afraid we know.
Yes,
I'm afraid.
and it's terrifying.
Yeah.
I was about to say I'm doing an about face, but I'm not really. I'd love to hear you speak about imperial recreation, gladiators, the Colosseum.
Yeah, now I think that, one chapter of my book is kind of time off. What did emperors do in their spare time? Well, it's
Very revealing.
it is extremely revealing. Augustus liked a nice bit of angling, he was a nice fisherman. Others, did a bit of watercolours. Marcus Aurelius, very nice painter, right? Can you imagine? The idea of a Roman emperor sitting there being like a Victorian lady.
I loved it, though.
Amazing, isn't it? Amazing. I think that the one thing that I'd want people to take away, I think the Colosseum and Gladiators is very important. But I think also we have tended to overestimate that in our view of Roman imperial and popular sport. That's partly because the Colosseum survives. It dominates Rome, and we're all horribly, and I mean horribly, in love with gladiators, right? We watch movies about them, we buy models of them, we have paintings of them. And that was an important element and a very puzzling element, actually, within Roman culture. And, I ought to say that a colleague of mine once told me, and I attributed and used his view in the book, that actually the Colosseum is much less raucous than we think.
Oh.
Everybody is dressed in their poshest dress. They're all dressed in togas. And he says it's more like going to the opera than it is like going to a wrestling match, right? It is the citizens of Rome ranked in their rank order. They're just watching slaughter. Right? But there's only 50,000 of them in the Colosseum. If you go to the racetrack, Circus Maximus, which doesn't really survive now, that probably took something like 250,000 people.
Good heavens.
And it's just under the Emperor's Palace, just under the Palatine Hill in Rome. And that is bigger than any modern football stadium.
Yes.
It took a quarter of the whole population of the city of Rome. And the relationship between the emperor and the racetrack is more important than anything. Now, why these horses are important with Caligula and the rest is that they're race horses. They're not horses going out on campaign to bash up unfortunate barbarians. They're racetrack horses. And the racetrack is actually the center of Roman popular culture in the empire. It also shows the emperor as, annoying. One emperor, I think it's Caligula, is very annoyed because he's living just above the racetrack when people come in at night to try and get the best seats, and they keep him awake, and he sends in the soldiers to say, off you go. But there is a passageway between the palace and the imperial box in the racetrack, and the emperors are well-known fans of particular horse races. And it's also the place where people make their views known. I mean, there is no elections now. That doesn't mean there's no popular opinion. And people demonstrate in the races. They tell the emperor what they think of him. Some emperors make terrible faux pas because they try to catch up with their correspondence in the racetrack.
Oh, dear.
And they get really told off, just like, I always think it's a bit like, if Prince William was found texting at a big football match. It's a very bad look,
yes.
Right? But it's absolutely, time off is also time on. And the emperor is judged by how he spends his free time. And if I was a Roman emperor, it would be onto the racetrack for me.
And I never thought about free time. We are ready for our Q&A. Thank you. Oh, this is a good question, Mary. What do we know about women in that period?
That is a very good question. And don't worry, the book is not just blokes, right?
No, it's not at all.
Not just blokes. It is extremely interesting because it is absolutely clear that there were some women under the rule of the emperors that had more practical power than any other women had ever had in the Roman world before. For the simple reason that once you get to a monarchy where decisions are taken behind closed doors, anybody who has the emperor's ear is powerful. So some slaves of the emperor are powerful.
Yes.
Because they shave him in the morning and they have a chance to say, "Excuse me, sir," you know.
And they're not going to succeed him.
They're not going to succeed him, and they can whisper in his ear. And the same thing goes for the women and the lovers, male and female.
I think of Livia and Agrippina.
Where it comes difficult is that the word in the ear and the power that comes from the word in the ear is, I think, quite important. You get a vision from some modern histories and from Robert Graves' I, Claudius, and indeed from Suetonius and ancient writers like Suetonius and Tacitus, that there were women like Agrippina and Nero's mum and Livia, Augustus's wife, or Julia Domna, the wife of Septimius Severus much later, who had a much acuter and directed sense of policy and power. That Livia in particular was trying to successfully make sure that she got her son, Tiberius, from a previous marriage onto the throne. And to do that, she poisoned, the Peritonitis problem again, she poisoned all the other potential heirs.
And she succeeded, as you said.
It was said she succeeded. Now, my problem with this is that that might be true. You know, you couldn't say that wasn't true. It looks to me like a kind of absolutely traditional blame the woman scenario. I mean, from, you know, throughout known history in the West, historians and, you know, more general commentators have usually tried to pin male mess-ups on women, right? Why did the Prime Minister do this? Well, it was because the wife said.
It's because of her.
Why did the emperor do this? Or why did that route of succession not play out? Well, it was because of Livia, right? You know, it's a cherchez la femme argument. And the palace is closed to us. Roman writers complained they didn't know really what happened, and it's always easy to blame the woman. And we're seeing that in the UK at the very minute. We're having an inquiry about Boris Johnson's handling of COVID and COVID lockdown, and what many of the witnesses in the inquiry are saying, you know, when they're commenting on Boris Johnson's mess, they're saying it was all because Mrs. Johnson, Carrie, was actually pulling the strings. You know, Nancy Reagan was another one. Cherie Blair in the UK was another one. And I think that goes back at least to Livia. You know, it's easy to blame the woman.
Well, this is a good segue then. To what degree is our understanding of ancient Rome influenced by contemporary values? Do you see today's culture reshaping how we think of Rome now?
I think inevitably we do, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think that, you know, if you think of history as a kind of conversation between the present and the past, then as the present changes, then you see different things in the past. And certainly, sometimes that's really to the good. When I was an undergraduate student, we didn't talk about women in the ancient world, and it was only kind of the second wave feminism of the sort of 70s that made us think, right, okay, we can ask different questions here. So I think the input of the present can sometimes be hugely eye-opening. Actually, it can, the fact that we're just talking about Livia as if it was obvious was not the case when I was a kid. I think, on the other hand, though, there is a danger of thinking about Roman emperors or thinking about the Romans as if they were kind of like us, only a little bit different. And that comes down to, what I was talking about before, which Roman emperor is Donald Trump most like? Well, none. The real answer is none. And I think the balance that you have, the tightrope you have to walk as a historian of the Roman Empire is both to see how the modern world can open your eyes to what's going on. And, I think an awful lot of Roman history, which Roman historians saw as awful conspiracy, is probably cock-up rather than conspiracy. It's the peritonitis, not poisoning. But you also have to see that you have to segue that with the fact that this is completely different.
Yes.
And the balance that you have to tread between actually the Romans being in all kinds of ways very like us, because they're human beings and they do the kind of things that we do, and we have learnt, in a sense, to think about our world from them. To balance that with the Romans are so alien that it's very hard to understand them is precisely, where the difficulty comes. I think in trying to understand any kind of deep history, or even the history of 100 years ago.
I read recently a question presented to an academic, which was, are there similarities, parallels between ancient Rome and the United States today? And the answer was very abrupt. No, Rome had better roads.
I think, though, I think that one difference I see in talking about ancient Rome in the UK and in the US is that there's different investment in ancient Rome in those two countries, and in the UK it's very much that ancient Rome was there. And we all learn about the Roman villas and the Roman roads, and London was a Roman city.
Yes.
And it's all about how the Romans basically, formed our geopolitics, which they did. We don't tend to think, or in kind of popular imagination, is not about Roman politics. Whereas you cannot avoid, thanks to the Founding Fathers, seeing some sense of a dialogue with Roman Republican values.
Yes, it's true.
We don't have we don't have a Senate, right? And I think that it's much easier to talk to an American audience about the politics of Rome than it is to a British audience. British audience always wants to know about drains and, baths and plumbing and the local villa,
Because maybe it's under my house.
Because it's under my house,
Right.
It's in your heads, in a way. Now, I don't think that doesn't, it doesn't determine what you think about ancient Rome. But, I've spent some time in Washington, D.C., and I think, blimey, I can't understand this without thinking about how they thought about ancient Rome politically.
Yes.
So,
I'm sure there are many budding writers in the room, at least we hope there are. And this is a good question from them. Can you talk about some of the primary sources you used?
I used some of the absolutely bog standard primary sources that anybody writing about the Roman Empire would use. I used the biographies of the first 12 emperors by Suetonius, and I used the histories of the annals of Tacitus, writing at about the same time. I think what was liberating about not doing biography myself and doing it thematically was that I was able to bring in lots more stuff really vivid ancient material that does not get looked at, gets out of the spotlight because it doesn't contribute to the biography of
Actually,
emperors.
that's fascinating. I would never have thought of that dimension, but it's really true, isn't it?
You know, if you want to
Yeah.
write a biography of an emperor, there's a whole lot of things you're not interested in. Mostly, that's what I am interested in.
Right.
You know, so, you know, one of and that is both in literature. I mean, I've had great fun with the doctor, the Greek-Roman doctor Galen, who, you know, treated the Emperor Marcus Aurelius and describes it. He treated his tummy upset with an anal suppository, which was the first example, I think, of an anal suppository in Western history. It doesn't usually get into the history books, though. But you can go, so you can look at other works of literature, but you also, I was looking very much at evidence that survives on papyri, or evidence that survives inscribed on stone. And, you know, one of the most amazing kind of vignettes that I didn't know about until I did this book was the letters sent in the 3rd century by a frustrated middle manager in the Roman province of Egypt. It's like having his emails, right? He's trying to organize a visit by the Emperor Diocletian, and he has to get all the kind of supplies in. It's like doing a royal visit for King Charles, but worse. And this poor bugger is sitting there trying to get a new bakery established.
Oh, good heavens.
For, you know, to cater for the guys who are coming, Diocletian and his entourage. And you see him writing down the food chain saying, surely you've got the bakery ready, right? And then writing up the food chain saying, I have tried to get them to get the bakery ready, but they're being terribly uncooperative, right? So you actually, through the eyes of the emperor, if you don't do it biographically, you can sort of open that up to some of the ordinary people like us doing their jobs.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Marcus Aurelius, though not necessarily as anal suppositories, but that's all right. This question is, was Marcus Aurelius overrated?
I think that he's extremely interesting. And I think in particular, his surviving letters with his tutor, Fronto, which are really letters between him, before he's emperor, and his tutor, often talking, I'm afraid, about their bodily ailments. Extremely interesting. I happen, and I'm very unfashionable here, and you can attack me later, I happen to think that Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, a absolute bestseller in the modern world, 2,000 years later, and terribly popular, and I have to accept that.
So he's not overrated.
I think, however, that I'm not sure how many people who admire the Meditations have actually read them.
Fair enough. Mary, I want to thank you. This has been enlightening and extremely fun. Thank you very, very much.